What comes to mind when you think of overseas Filipinos? You might think of OFWs and all of their hardships. They are called modern day heroes, and yet horror stories of abuse always come up in the news. While OFW challenges abound, the Filipino diaspora is far from homogeneous. There are stories of jadedness and getting into precarious work. There are the dreamers, the success stories, and those content with their lives abroad, yet missing home. With such a variety of stories, Filipino journalists covering the diaspora become familiar with the ups and downs of the migrant experience. Hello, I'm Michelle Abad, and this is At Home sa Abroad, Rappler's one stop show for everything related to the Filipino diaspora. Here, we discuss topics important to Filipinos all over the world, from concerns in welfare of overseas Filipino workers, to celebrating Pinoy success stories, to reconnecting to cultural roots at iba pa. For this episode, just to change things up a little, I'll be speaking to Ana Santos, a fellow journalist. I've had the pleasure to work with Ana in the past, but today we'll be talking about how a reporter goes about covering Filipino migration. Ana is a multimedia journalist specializing in gender issues. She has also covered labor migration in Europe and the Middle East as the Pulitzer Center 2014 Persephone Miel Fellow and Grantee. Hi, Ana. Welcome to the show.
Having me.
Hey, nice to see you, Anna. So let's just get the ball rolling and maybe just go back in time a little bit. So you're a freelance journalist with the freedom to write about anything you
Mm.
want. How did you get into reporting about Filipino migration?
I think Michelle, I could go back a little bit more just as a background, right? I started my reporting career writing about women's issues, and it was mostly because I was angry. I was so angry at the state of women's reproductive health access in the Philippines. And I just felt that it had so much to do with the trajectory of a woman's life, right? What kind of reproductive health access you can have. And then there's no divorce, all of these things. It played so much of an impact on how women could advance their life and uplift their life and just achieve your dreams. So I got so angry about how there was such limits on these things in the Philippines that I said, okay, I can do one or two things. I can just pound on my keyboard and be angry and just simmer, or I can pound on my keyboard and write stories about it and actually hope that those stories will reach people who can make a difference and who care about these issues as much as I do. And then I realized through when I got the grant from the Pulitzer Center that my concerns about reproductive health access and sexual health rights was also deeply connected to labor migration. A lot of the migrant workers that I spoke to were single mothers like me, or, they were trying to get away from their really painful marriages through the polite way of labor migration, but because there's no divorce, labor migration became the way out. So I realized that all these things, reproductive health access, sexual health rights, also intersected with labor migration and the way that, Filipinos would see working abroad as a way to uplift their life. And that just became, a sense of where everything came to a point of intersection and a point of things that mattered to me and things that were important.
I love how you talked about intersection. We will be talking about that more, but then we share a lot of common because I also cover women's issues for
Mm.
Rappler. It started as a passion for me. I mean, they asked me like what I wanted to cover and what I was passionate about, and it did start with women's issues. Eventually, like labor migration was also assigned to me, and then I did start to realize the same things that you did, that they were somehow connected, and that there are also gendered aspects of labor migration. But more on that later. I want to ask, what are some of the most memorable stories you've covered about Filipino migrants?
Wow, there's a lot. I think covering the Filipino diaspora, I realized so much how all of all of us are so much the same. But in answer to your question, there are two stories I think that really stand out to me. The first one is my series on Filipino migrant mothers. It's called Who Takes Care of Nanny's Children, and it was about Filipino mothers who or migrant workers who work as domestic workers taking care of other people's children. Meanwhile, they have to leave their own behind. And when I got this assignment, this was one of my it was the first. It was my first cross-border assignment talking about Filipino migrants or OFW experience. And Michelle, I had this whole I think I was quite naive there. I had this whole image of okay, I'm gonna cover an airport scene because it's so dramatic and there's a lot of goodbyes there. So that would be a very dramatic opening scene, whether I write about it, whether I film it, whether I photograph it. But then when I was talking to the respondents, I asked them, how did you say goodbye to your kids? And the answer was they don't. And for the first few responses, I was like, oh, hindi po, hindi na lang po kayo nagpaalam. And I corroborated this with, NGO workers and CSO workers who said the same. They would have stories of mothers who would say that they were going to the market. They would just tell their children, "I'm going to the market." And then they would leave their baggage in a neighbor's house and they would go straight to the airport and they wouldn't say goodbye. And to this day, this was my first assignment. To this day, this like grabs at my heart. And I cannot imagine, the mother in me says, "How could you?" But also
Mhm.
understands exactly why. But also the child in me, or who's a child of a mother and who could have made those choices, it also feels like I'm screaming inside, "How could you?" But I know, I mean, talking to them and hearing most of their stories, I just know that sometimes it's easier to say goodbye when you know you will come back. And for many of these mothers, they don't know when they will be able to come back or if they will. So that was something that was very unsettling for me. I think because yeah, as a woman, as a mother as well, it seemed like the way I would always describe this is it felt like I was looking inequality in the face and it looked just like me. You know, as a Filipino journalist covering the Filipino diaspora, we're talking about stories of people who look like us, sound like us, and have the exact same dreams of uplifting their families from and giving their loved ones a better life. But the extent that we have to go to, the sacrifices that we have to make to realize that better life for our loved ones is just so different and it's just a world apart. And I always question, I mean, I think that assignment has always made me question the unfairness of all of that. And well, if I still have time to go into this question, my other favorite story or most remarkable story for me was the story of our Filipino fishermen who have been kidnapped and they were held in captivity for 5 years. I did this story also for Rappler. This was the story of Mr. Elmer Balbero. And so he was fishing off of the Indian Ocean and was held captive for over 5 years by Somali pirates. And finally, when he came back home, they were rescued. The Philippine government had organized a press conference at the airport for them. And of course, I went. And, I didn't realize till later on that this was the first time that these fishermen, never having seen their families over 5 years, no contact also because they were held in captivity, this was the first time that they were going to be reunited with their families. And Michelle, try to imagine that first time after 5 years, they were swarmed by reporters TV reporters, online reporters like me, trying to get quotes, trying to interview them. And I felt like, I felt it was a little predatory of us. I mean, if there was any point in my career where I felt like this is not a day where I'm proud of what I do, I think it would be that. But secondly, during that story, when I was interviewing also the NGOs who were involved in the support of the families of our kidnapped fishermen, I said, "Oh, this is great! They've been rescued," and I will never forget that worker said to me, "Anna, you know that this is just the beginning, right?" And I was like, ano po ibig niyo sabihin?" Sabi niya, "This is just the beginning. Mas mahirap yung pag-assimilate niya sa pamilya niya, getting to know his family again, getting back to normal life." Sabi niya, when you think about what he now has to go through to go back to normal life, madali yung pag-rescue. So that always made me feel like, oh nga, no, what happens after rescue? And most of the time, our stories end there after rescue. So it took me a while, it took me a few years, but I did go back to that story of Mr. Elmer Balbero. And when we did that story for Rappler, I was able to interview his daughters, and that was magnificent, Michelle, because they said the daughter said that they didn't have contact with their family and with their father rather, and it was during that those 5 years of absence, it was only them, the two sisters, and their mother who believed that their father was still alive. Everyone else was telling them, you have to move on, he's probably dead, and you just have to get on with life. And one of the daughters, the eldest one, said that she always prayed that I'm going to turn 18 soon. It's just my wish that my father will be home and will dance my first dance during the 18th birthday, which is so important to us. And a few months before she turned 18, he was rescued and he was brought back home. And for that story that we did on Rap, they shared with us a photo of their first dance. So I think that was one of that story still stays with me, and I still think of these families often.
Mhm. It's really mind-boggling for me, like the variety of situations that OFWs get into just for that opportunity to provide more for their families and give their families a better life. And it kind of damages them in different ways, from like their physical safety, like you're a seafarer that has to deal with pirates who don't speak your language, and like even if you might be good at negotiating in your own language, they're foreigners. And then apart from the physical safety, it's also like they have to deal with the emotional danger that they have to go through as well, with when they have to deal with being separated from their families. So it's like an all over type of grief that some of these OFWs go through. But yeah, I think like related to these types of experiences is the fact that I think a common notion that people think of, like I said earlier, is that they think about the OFW abuses and the hardships that they experience abroad. Do you think that's like something wrong that the media gets? Like, what are your thoughts on this? And do you think that's something that we need to fix?
I did a research before about the media representation of OFWs, and we found that it was mostly around economics, whether it's just the remittances that they bring back home or the emotions of it, and which is playing to what you said. It's all about the abuse and the exploitation of OFWs. And I think my discomfort with that is it really paints OFWs, number one, as victims. Like, oh, mag-abroad ka, susugal ka, tapos, you're going to be abused and exploited. Of course, that's a possibility. And that is something that we have to be mindful of and report on as our job as journalists. But I think my discomfort in all of that is that's not all there is to the migrant life. And what about the ways that migrants are, they are finding ways of being resilient. They are finding ways of navigating the system, being in a country, where they don't even speak your language. Sometimes it's a whole different alphabet. There's a different culture to get used to. I think that part of the migrant experience also has to be talked about, because that, I think, will now center also migrants as just like us, because when you talk about them in terms of being economic saviors or being open to all sorts of abuse and exploitation, there's this tendency na, ay, hindi ako yan. Hindi mangyayari sa akin yan. Right? So that kind of separates us from migrant workers. But when you think about it, as Filipinos, I don't know of any family in the Philippines who doesn't have a family member who's an OFW or
Mhm.
isn't, an OFW themselves, notwithstanding how big our nuclear families are, how far they can extend. Pero di ba, I'd be hard pressed to find an example of a person who doesn't have an OFW with their family. So, given that, it's quite ironic that it's so close to us as an issue, but still, we want to disassociate ourselves from being called or the OFW experience, because what we know of it is yan, either abuse, exploitation, maltreatment, trafficking, or yeah, bringing home remittances. And I think, there's so much more to be said about migrants as a people, and how they become different, sometimes different characters also through the liberation of being abroad. What does that do to you? And I think, yeah, there's just more space for the multifaceted experience of being a migrant worker, just as every person is a multifaceted person.
Yeah, I'm gonna dig into that a little bit more about how you said that there's way more to the Filipino diaspora than just, the OFW abuses and them being exploited. Because, OFW is not like equal to victim, right? They're not always victims of,
Mm.
of what they go through, even if it's bad. Sometimes they will still own their own choices and say that, I'm resilient, even though that can be problematic of its own, right? Like capitalizing on resilience of OFWs. But anyway, since we're talking about how, OFWs and the Filipino diaspora are not homogenous. So can you like delve into the common themes and stories that you've seen among the different types of migrants?
I'll go from like the ones that are I find funny, and the ones that I found like really stayed with me. I did this story when I was reporting on the migrant workers in Paris. So I met this woman called Ate Luz, and the other OFWs were telling me, you have to meet her. She's just so funny, and her stories are the best. So she's the kind of woman na paulit-ulit yung mga stories niya, but people always want to hear it kasi natatawa sila. And so they set up a lunch for me with Manang Luz, and she told me, "Oh, Anna, my first few days here in my first few weeks here in Paris, I didn't know how to speak French, and so I understood nothing of the French language, and I was working for this woman, Madame, and she told me to call her husband. So I said, Cherie, Cherie, Ma'am is calling you. Madame is calling you. And then they both started laughing, and I couldn't figure out why they were laughing. Sabi niya gano'n, yung pala, na-gets niya later on na Cherie means darling. Eh, yun daw yung naririnig niyang tinatawag ni Madame kay Sir, Cherie. So, akala niya, yun ang pangalan ni Sir. So, she was calling him Cherie, Cherie.
Oh
That was
no.
so funny. Di ba yung mga ganong stories na natuwa ako dun, Michelle, kasi parang yun yung mga 'di ba you find these stories in our life. 'Pag bago ka sa trabaho mo, you will find things na bloopers or things that are funny that happen to you. And then you just,
Mhm.
laugh at it, and it becomes a way of kind of softening the edges of navigating a new place. So I thought that was one of the funniest stories about the migrant experience that I've been covering. Yeah, Manang Luz is one. Another one was we did a documentary for Rappler about migrant mothers, and this was the Mangera family. And until now, I'm in touch with them. But we filmed that. The mother was a migrant worker in Saudi Arabia, and we filmed it while she was in the Philippines. And she came home specifically for the graduation of one of her daughters. And when the film came out on Rappler, Mrs. Mangera had already gone back to Saudi Arabia. And Michelle, I'll never forget it. My phone started ringing with an unknown number, and I said, "Oh my God, who's this?" And it was Mrs. Mangera, and she called me to say that nakita ko na yung film niya tungkol sa family ko. And she didn't have the right words. She was grappling for it. Sabi niya, hindi ko alam kung paano ko sasabihin sa'yo, pero parang nagkaroon ba ako ng sense, yung ewan ko, hindi ko malaman. Basta parang na-feel ko na meron pala akong may maibibigay. Yung she was talking like this in phrases, and she just said, "Di ko alam, basta magpapasalamat ako sa inyo at sa inyo lahat sa Rappler na binigyan niyo kami ng pagkakataon i-share yung story namin." It was a very everyday story of a Filipino migrant family. Nothing newsworthy about it. It's just their struggles and how they tried to be a family still, how they kept in touch, and how the other parts of the family also reacted to Mrs. Mangera's, absence. So Can you imagine that? Hindi niya ma-express yung sarili niya. So I just said, no, we're very happy then na binigyan niyo po kami ng pagkakataon to be part of your family and to, to be part of a day in your life. And when I put down the phone, I realized, ito siguro yung sinasabi ng mga woke at saka yung mga millennials na, yeah, they felt seen. And nakita ko rin, covering on the side of when I've shadowed migrant workers in the Middle East and in Europe, for example. As a domestic worker, napaka-invisible mo. You are in the house, working, toiling all day, but you are invisible until somebody needs you to get a glass of water or to clean something or para pagalitan ka. Ganun ka, ganun minsan yung naging day of your life. So I totally got what she meant, that this made us feel seen. And it was a very simple thing, but it meant, I think, the world to them, and her call to me meant the world to me.
Yeah. Sobrang iba-iba talaga 'no, yung mga kwento nila. Like for me naman, parang yung napapansin kong differences is like sobrang iba yung coverage nung parang iba yung utak ko sa coverage ng OFWs versus my coverage of permanent migrants. Like even in like the matter of the way I speak, right? Kasi syempre kapag OFW na sanay sila sa Pilipinas, magtatagalog ako sa kanila. And then pagkakausap ka naman ng permanent migrants sa US, for example, or sa Canada, biglang I'm gonna turn on my accent, and then you're gonna adjust the way you speak to like depending on who you're talking to, but still all of them are part of the Filipino diaspora. Like, something I notice is that a lot of OFWs dream of coming home to their families if they're temporary migrants in places like maybe the Middle East or Singapore or Hong Kong. But I noticed that some of the other OFWs or permanent migrants or dual citizens that live in, say, other countries like Canada and the US, instead of wanting to go home someday, they want to bring their family in the Philippines to their country someday. Right? So it's like they're so different in a lot of ways.
Right.
So maybe since let's go back into the intersectionality thing. So like we talked about earlier how we both saw how women's issues also delve into migration issues. So you and I are both women's rights and migration reporters, and we know that, for example, there are more OFW women than
Mhm.
men. So how does gender play a role in the issues of migration?
I think at the surface level, when you speak about migrant mothers and those mothers who work as domestic workers and take care of other people's children, it will never going abroad will never be the seen as the same for mothers and fathers. Fathers, when they go abroad, and they were the ones who first the fathers were the first ones, right, to lead the OFW diaspora. They were the ones working in the oil rigs in Saudi, for example. When the fathers left, they were seen as performing their duty of being good providers, and so they were lauded for it. But the women, especially the mothers, when they go abroad, it's always seen as an abandonment of their responsibility to their families. And I found a number of, when I was in grad school and I took that break from the reporting grid, I found a number of stories and anthropological studies that said that even NGO workers would say, how can she leave her children behind? Alam mo, napakasakit nun. Kasi gets ko eh. I mean, I'm a mom too, and I know that if I also had limitations in terms of the opportunities and the life that I could give my child, I would go abroad just to see if it could make things better. You roll the dice on that, right? Pero totoo din na how could you? And I think the mothers ask themselves that more than anybody else and more than these NGO workers. One time, I'll tell you, I was doing a story in Dubai, and our subject was a migrant worker. Her name was Nida, and she was talking about how she had to leave her son right after she had given birth. I think he was like 3 months old when she decided to go back to Dubai, and she said, and I'll never forget this. She said, "Now, she was still lactating because she had just given birth. So what reminded her of her separation from her son was that her breasts would leak breast milk because it would be time dapat para mag-breastfeed, but she didn't have her son with her. So imagine mo yon na kung ano yung turmoil nun. Tapos the photographer that I was working with was a foreign one, and after the interview and everything, she talked to Nita. Nita, what are you doing here? You must go home absolutely after this. No, don't waste another minute. You have to go home. And we just looked at her. Okay, yeah, okay. And afterwards, I took that photographer aside and I said, I don't think you should be asking her that. I think that question comes from a very privileged background. And I'm sorry, but we don't all have the same life choices. So we make the decisions that we do based on the life choices that are open to us. And I don't think you can ask her or any other migrant woman or any woman who has made a choice that's different from yours that kind of question.
Mhm. That is really interesting, but like I also wanted to know like what's your process in finding these types of stories? You know that we always talk about like, you said earlier that probably everybody that probably everyone I know has at least one relative that's abroad. So like how do we figure out which stories to highlight and maybe just to like connect that to a next question? Like what are the challenges that you run into when you're choosing your stories?
Michelle, we've talked about this also, right? At some point, there are stories that follow you,
Mhm.
right? There are some stories that find you. And yeah, that's happened to me many times on the migrant trail. Like I'm reporting on one issue, the last story that I did on Filipino truck drivers who were trafficked into Europe. There were a number of other stories that followed me then. And then I said, wait lang, because I don't have the capacity and the bandwidth to report on all of this at the same time. And I want to go very much in depth into when it comes to OFW stories. So I have to park them for a bit. And that's one. There are some stories that will just really follow you and nearly beg you to write them. Yeah, you know this, as a reporter as well. Secondly, sometimes there's just one small quote, one small sentence, like the one I was telling you about, that NGO worker who told me that rescue is the easy part. After being kidnapped, it's reintegrating into normal life and finding out what normal life is like. That's the harder part. That stayed with me, and that always was like prompted me to look into other stories about after rescue and what else can be done. And I think also it's more of just a passion as well, right? Like I'm fascinated to find out what other things the communities are doing apart from, there's so many nice stories that are just everyday about the migrant experience. In Qatar, for example, there's a group of migrants every day on Friday, which is the day off in Qatar. There's a boardwalk there. It's called the Corniche, and it's like the center of town. But try to imagine it's a boardwalk. So parang runway, di ba? So every Friday, may mga migrants doon who totally dress up and rumarampa doon sa Corniche na yon. And there's actually an Instagram account started about the fashion of migrant workers in Qatar. And I get it. They would say that every day from Sunday to Thursday naka-uniform sila because most of the migrant workers there are construction workers or they work in service, so nasa hotel, nasa restaurant. And Friday is the one day that they can come out and express themselves and also just try to be who they are and enjoy themselves. So I like that also. Although I have to say pala, when I presented that case study in a class just recently, they asked me, but doesn't that just show you that migrants aren't all oppressed? And the migrant experience, isn't that going to be harder to push for reforms when it comes to migrant workers? And I said, no, I want I would like to think that we need to see more of migrants who are like us, but also realize that they have to work under really just undescribable and inhumane working and unjust working conditions sometimes. And it's precisely because they are like us, but have to work under unjust human conditions and working conditions and such low pay that we should really feel that it's wrong the way that migrants are seen, treated, or paid and and exploited in other countries.
Mm, okay. I just want to like sneak in one question about the politics of OFWs because I
Mm,
did start to think about this a little bit, like how let's go back to the election this year. And we saw that the overseas election, mm, it was the Ferdinand Marcos Jr. also won for the OFWs, and it can also be seen in a bunch of social media groups that there's a bunch of support for the Marcoses abroad. But then, if we go back in time, we know that Marcos Sr., the late dictator, it was his idea to do labor exportation for as a policy for economic growth, and so we have these OFWs who for the very reason that their families were split apart by generation. But now we also see them showing high popularity for Marcos Jr. So what are
mhm.
your thoughts on this?
That's such a hard question, to be honest. And I think a lot of it we can't discount the disinformation really that started so many years ago with the Duterte administration, and this was all well documented, right? How they had started disinformation campaigns, really also targeting specific communications and messages for the OFW community. I think what kind of worked or resonated with the OFW community was the idea that they have this better life also here, and I think so at some point it kind of disconnects you from the everyday difficulties of living in Metro Manila or in the Philippines. And when you think about it, it's the everyday living, right? That kind of phrase at your love for country, right? I think may konting ganon dissonance now when you've been a migrant worker and have been living abroad for a couple of years, and at the same time, you know, most of the OFWs, like a lot of people now around the world, they will get their information on Facebook, on TikTok, on YouTube. And these sources of information aren't always, well, yeah, they're not fact checked and they're completely partisan. So let's take, I think it's a confluence of all those things. One, your years abroad, which may have kind of, dissociated you from the everyday realities of living in the Philippines, and which goes back to what you said, that they want to bring their families abroad rather than go back home. Secondly, the disinformation campaign that has been well orchestrated and really well funded by both the Duterte administration and the administration of Marcos Jr. And third, it's where they get their information. It's on social media, and these are the channels that are so pervasive, but also so difficult to police and regulate, that the half truths and the lies and the perversions of the truth that you see on social media just flow into your, the algorithm feeds it onto your timeline, and it just is absorbed subconsciously and you think about it as the truth.
Mm, okay. All right. That is a really complex problem, like when you've been away and the only access you have to your homeland is through social media, and we know that this information is pretty bad on social media. How can we avoid it with OFWs? So that's another rabbit hole that can be discussed in a different episode. But
Yes.
maybe just to wrap things up here briefly, maybe let's go back to media representation a little bit on OFWs.
Mm.
So maybe briefly, Anna, what do you think we should do better about the media representation of OFWs, and how can we contribute to the discussions in such a way that Filipino migrants are empowered and also heard when they face hardships?
I think we can go back to what you were talking about earlier, Michelle, intersectionality. the intersectional factors that play into the migrant experience. So they're not just all either successful migrant or abused and exploited migrant. What about the intersectionality of identities? For example, this weekend, I'm going to a drag show where the performer is a drag queen who is also a nurse here. I mean, fantastic, right? Hindi ba migrant story din yon, Michelle? Diaspora story din
Mm,
yon? Oh,
that's right.
so nasan yun? Nasan yun sa repertoire of reportage natin on the Filipino diaspora? So one is intersectionality. Second, I think is the families left behind. Ito yung ito na tayo. 'Di ba? Yung families natin are sometimes pieced together by may family ka abroad, okay, may kapatid ka abroad, may magulang ka abroad. Pero you make your own family also, your own strong family unit sa Pilipinas. So, ano na yung itsura ng Filipino family ngayon? Ngayon na migration has touched so much of our lives. So I would love to see stories like that na again beyond yung oh, OFW family ka, broken family ka, wala kang pagmamahal, dysfunctional yung family mo. Tama na. What other stories are there about the Filipino families and the new forms that they take on? Because we've seen this, right? There's still so much love and community in the families that we have. It's just not the usual shape or form that we have always thought of before. And I think third is how can we get more migrant voices in our stories? And I I mean we should take the cue from them on how they want their stories to be told. There's, for example, there are a number of migrant workers, domestic workers who are on TikTok, and they are talking about their crazy working hours. They're sometimes very low pay, and sometimes they don't have a day off. They're talking about it on TikTok, but they're doing it to a song and dance and or a mimicry. One domestic worker was talking about how sometimes she gets advances from the men in the household and how she deflects it, and it gives you a whole different perspective of how they have to deal with what the hazards of their workplace in a way that that's creative, in a way that's also hindi man sila matitignan na victim kasi nga they're looking for ways to navigate the difficulties of their workplace. And so I would love like most of that as well to come out. How these stories of migrant work, how are they telling their stories? Let's take our cue from there. I think one way we were able to do that in Rappler was when we did the series about our migrant fishermen. So these are our fishermen who fish out in the deep sea, in the middle of the ocean, literally nowhere, and there's no internet signal there, and they're gone for like 1 year or 1.5 years. So imagine being cut off from reality for that period of time. And because napakalayo din and inaccessible in the middle of the ocean, we didn't have any footage, for that report, and it was about COVID. So we actually put together that story using the footage that the fishermen got while they were on board. Ito yung mga nagbi-video sila ng isa't isa, nagpi-picture sila. So I thought that was also more collaborative, if I may say, in terms of how we put together a story that also showed the migrant perspective from their perspective. So I would like to see more stories about migrants by migrants.
Wonderfully said, Anna. I mean, it's definitely we should give a chance for the Filipino migrants to tell their stories over, us telling their stories. But, even though we are media, like it how can we amplify them better and tell their stories better? So I think we can end there. Thank you, Anna, for your time.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Again, you're tuned into At Home sa Abroad on Rappler. I'm Michelle Abad. Thank you for listening.